Hello and welcome to another video in this series looking at the 5 key quotations which will get you the very top grades at GCSE. And I hope you're feeling quite liberated that it only takes 5. In a minute I'll show you the 5 key quotations from My Last Duchess and remind you, if you haven't seen this already, my technique for answering the question the Foss way, where F stands for form, O is the opening, S is the language features which you may have learnt at SOAP Aims, the other S is the structure, and then finally the ending. If you follow this structure you are guaranteed the top grades. One reason for that is form does not appear until grade 7 in the mark scheme, and structure is an easy way to get up that mark scheme as well. And then finally, when you write about the ending of the poem, you're always writing about the poet's point of view, and that again is at the top of the mark scheme. Okay, I want to show you how liberating this technique is and how it forces you to get the top marks. So I'm going to pick the beginning no matter what it is, because that's always the most important part of the poem other than the ending. So here I'm going to talk about the form. So the form is a monologue. It's a dramatic monologue. It's spoken entirely by the Duke, and we don't get the replies of his witness, who's the representative of the Count. So we can use that to show the Duke's self-importance. We'll also be able to talk about it being written in rhyming couplets, so that starts to get into the structure point. And if I can say why it's in rhyming couplets, then I'm really starting to earn my living, as it were, and get the top grades. So one reason that it's written in rhyming couplets is that he is creating the illusion of wholeness. He wants to couple, to have another partner, and therefore he writes in couplets. But of course, when we look at the power relationship, then there is no equality between the two parts of the couple. The Duke is far more important than the Duchess. And the other thing that the couplets tell us is that this speech has been heavily rehearsed. It's not natural speech at all. So the Duke has thought some time about what he's going to say, which is astonishing when we consider he's just about to reveal that he had his last Duchess killed. So this is a man who feels completely above the law. Now, we can link that to the dangers of the patriarchal society. And here Browning is pointing out that men in this society have too much power, and that this power is a corruption. It corrupts and leads to murder. I can go in a little deeper here and talk about the enjambment here. So this is where the Duke tries to disguise the fact that he's speaking in rhyming couplets. He wants to disguise that this is a fully prepared speech. In fact, later on he'll even claim that he doesn't have skill in this kind of speaking. Now we've got some excellent language interpretations that we can use here. So obviously we can picture the word last here as an allusion to death. So she is the last Duchess, but she is not the last permanent Duchess, by which I mean she is just the latest in a long list. He wants another list, and it also implies that he's married more than one Duchess and possibly executed more than one. This was just one in a long line. We can also look at this description here, painted on the wall. Now, what most critics miss here is that this is not a painting that is hung on the wall, it's a fresco. A fresco is painted directly onto the plaster. We know that because the artist, Frau Pandolf, only worked on it for one day, and that was exactly how frescoes were painted, because you had to finish the painting before the plaster dried. That was the technique. Now this gives us a real sense of urgency in the Duke, and it gives us this massive clue. He doesn't decide to have her painted until he's decided to have her killed. Now we can see that the artwork is much more important than the Duchess herself, and it also shows us how desperate he is to have her killed quickly. which is why he's had her painted quickly. He can't even wait for this artist to paint her in an oil painting, which might take weeks, because that would mean that he'd have to spend too long before he could have her executed. It shows how vicious and callous he is. And then we can link that to his callous humour, where he's saying, look, she looks like she's alive there, doesn't she? And the humour is, that was the very moment I was planning to have her killed. Right, so we've actually already written about the form here, and we talked about the structure, why that's there at the beginning and the enjambment, and we've talked about the opening, just with one quotation. So we've already nailed most of grade 7 just on that single quotation. Now the next thing that's going to get me high marks is considering alternative interpretations, and you've possibly been taught that it is sexual jealousy that is the motive for the Duke killing his wife. So I'm going to give you an alternative interpretation that there isn't any sexual jealousy at all. So let's have a look at this quotation. "'Twas not her husband's presence only." Now that word only tells us that he was there while Frau Pandolf was painting her. In other words, there is no sense that she could have been flirting behind his back or having any kind of sexual relationship with Frau Pandolf because he was there. His presence was there. A further element that all of Browning's audience would have picked up on that we don't is the name, Frau Pandolf. Frau is short for friar. In other words, this artist is a monk. Yeah, he's learnt his skill painting the plaster of churches. And well, it's very unlikely that a monk is going to have an affair with the Duchess, or indeed that she would find a monk with his strange habit and strange haircut remotely attractive anyway. So this idea of sexual jealousy is utterly implausible here. Now, you could argue that he's sexually jealous, and Browning is pointing out that this is a ridiculous emotion to have given the circumstances. You can have that interpretation if you want, or you can argue that there isn't actually any sexual tension here at all. In fact, I'm going to argue with another quotation that there isn't a sexual relationship between the Duke and his wife. Now we can zoom in on this word spot. If you think about Lady Macbeth without damned spot, if you think about the black spot presented in Treasure Island, you'll see that this is a recurring motif to suggest a spot of guilt, of sin. So the language that the Duke is using is suggesting that his wife has been sinful, but her sin isn't sex here. Her sin is that she is taking joy in life. Now you can look at the whole of this poem and see that the Duke doesn't take any joy in life at all. The only things he takes joy in are objects which he can own, and those are artworks or money. The dowry, for example, that he's asking for from the Count. Now, in this quotation, we're going to look at his real motives. So he's disappointed in her. He wants to kill her because it seems as though she has ranked his gift of his name that goes back 900 years with anybody else's gift. So what's going on here is that she has not learnt her place in the patriarchy and the class system. She's not looking to his title of the Duke and realizing that this is the most important gift that she could have. She is the Duchess. In other words, status does not mean anything to her. And in fact, we can look at that objectively with the kinds of things that she's so happy to get. You know, the white mule, there it is, and the red cherries, things which are essentially worthless but natural, which he finds disgusting in her, because what she should be valuing is her social status and much more his social status, which has conferred that on her. Now this also allows me to get in a structure point, because this couplet here of thanked and ranked give us 11-syllable lines where the rest of the monologue are 10-syllable lines. And so that evidence there proves to us that this is the moment when he loses control. Everything else is 10 syllables. He loses control here and makes it 11 syllables. And it forces the reader to ask why. What's going on in his mind causes him to lose control. And it is that. It's what we've just discussed, that his social status is being disrespected by his wife. She doesn't know her place in the patriarchy. Now we come to our last two quotations. So this one is quite interesting because it tells us that he had his wife killed. So you'll always have to use that in your essay. But who passed without much the same smile. But this smile then leads to him killing her. This grew. I gave commands, then all smiles stopped together. So this suggests, the plural of smiles, suggests that he's had her killed and perhaps another man. So people take that as evidence that he suspects her of having an affair, suspects her of infidelity. Well, that is possible. The other possibility is that she has too many smiles and he's just killed her. I'm quite happy for you to argue either way. But what's really annoyed him here is that she is smiling at her husband in the same way that everybody else does whenever he passed her. Now that tells us that again he's killing her because of her lack of respect for him. She just gives him the respect that everybody else does, not the respect that a wife does. Now again, this emphasis on the word past, as though she's passing by, shows that he has no interest in her whatsoever. Certainly no sexual interest. They're not spending time together. She smiles at him when they pass each other in rooms or corridors or on the balcony. In other words, from the outset, she's always been a possession. And I'd argue here that he probably does not have a sexual relationship with any of his duchesses. Certainly we could add to that the lack of a child mentioned in the poem to suggest that he's simply not interested in sex, not interested in sexual passion. And that fits his character, doesn't it? Because he is incredibly cold. He has no passions other than for things which are not human, wealth and art. We also have another one of the Duke's cruel little jokes here, because the word past is also a euphemism for death. We can still say so-and-so passed, as in passed away. And so he's imagining her smiling at the very minute that she was killed. It's as though she didn't expect it. He's possibly got somebody, he's commanded them, somebody that she knows to kill her. And so it has come as a complete surprise. She's died unaware with the smile still on her face. And that's emphasized here. It gives us the idea of the suddenness of her death and how unexpected it was. And it also reminds us that he's not even had a conversation with his wife about the things that she's doing that he doesn't like. Can you imagine living with someone like that, who instead of actually talking to you just decides it's far more easy to have you executed? Now this gives us a wider contextual point where the Duke represents the nobility, and Browning is attacking the ruling classes not just in Italy but in Britain. And what he's saying is the ruling classes are heartless, they're obsessed with their wealth, and they have no feeling for the common man, and even more important, for women. Because again, he is attacking this sexist society that allows men to exercise their power against women and treat them as possessions. And we can see that in the language that he uses later on when he's talking about the dowry. And so for those of you who don't know, a dowry is where the bride's father has to pay the prospective husband money in order to have this worthless woman. She's only worth the money that her father puts up to buy into the Duke's family. Now that's something that's still going on in the 1800s. This is something which Browning disapproves of, And what he's saying is, even now in the 1800s, which for him is obviously the modern day, women are treated as the possessions of their husbands. And that was true all the way up until the 1870s, when women were, for the first time, allowed to keep their property when they're married. But at the time this poem was written, they weren't. Everything they owned went to their husbands. And this is something of which Browning disapproves. So let's check some language features which we might have used here. So this obviously is a metaphor for death. I'm going to use the word metaphor when I write about it. In this quotation we had contrast or juxtaposition, the juxtaposition of any gift with the gift of his 900-year-old name. And here the word we're going to use for terminology is how this is symbolism or symbolic of sin. And here we already talked about the use of couplets and enjambment, and I didn't mention it, but you can, the use of iambic pentameter. And so this brings us to the ending and the final metaphor. So the metaphor is the god Neptune taming a seahorse. Now you've probably been taught, I hope, that Neptune represents the Duke in his own mind. He sees himself as godlike. He has the power of life and death. And then the seahorse represents the last Duchess who he's tried to tame, and also represents the new Duchess, the Count's daughter, who he also hopes to tame. We can take that a step further and say this represents the patriarchal society where men are treated as gods and women are treated as less than human, inferior beings without rights, who are tamed by their husbands, completely subservient to them. Excellent, I've nailed my grades at 7 and above. Now I'm going to give you some context to go beyond that. So Neptune was actually given powers as a god, and he created horses in his Greek form as Poseidon. So he actually introduced horses into the world as a god. They were his creatures. Now, when we know that, his desire to give Neptune a seahorse actually shows that he is inferior. He sees himself as a god, but actually the god was able to create real horses, whereas in this artwork it's just tiny, infinitesimally small creatures, the seahorse. Now, even though it wasn't one of our quotations, hopefully you remember the white mule that his wife rode. So this is a bit of a cheat here because it's an extra quotation, but I think it's referenced by the seahorse. Now, the white conveys innocence, but the mule is a marriage of a donkey and a horse. And a mule can't reproduce, it's sterile. And it's a little clue here that perhaps Neptune, in the form of the Duke, is unable to reproduce. Again, it strongly hints that there is no sexual relationship between the two. Another level of irony is, of course, that the white mule is much more impressive than a seahorse, which suggests that in life the Duchess was far greater in her power than the Duke is, who feels like a god. Now we can go further. We can start looking at the name dropping of artists who are presumably famous within the world of this monologue, and he wants his speaker to be in awe of the fact that he can afford such wonderful masterpieces. And then we can have a final structure point where he makes sure that the last word of the poem is me! Exclamation mark, which shows how egomaniacal or self-centered he is as a character. So hopefully you can see how those 5 key quotations force you to follow my Fossway method. Form will always get you into grade 7 and above, so will the structure. And as you should know by now, because I keep telling you in virtually every video, when you write about the ending of the text, you're always dealing with the writer's final perspective, and therefore always writing about interpretations and always getting into the very top grades. Well, if you'd like more videos in this series, please give me some comments, give me some likes, and if you want top grades, why not subscribe? See you soon on my channel.